Good morning. It's John Raymond here, actually. I'm filling in for Sarah this morning as she's unwell. And actually, Pete Cord, who's also on the call here from NetThreat, is sounding pretty ropey as well this morning. So we'll see how we get on. Fortunately, Ollie is sounding fit as a fiddle, and he's the star presenter, so we should be good. Still a few people joining, so I'll slightly... Of course, we are recording the session, and obviously we'll send a copy of that to everybody and to anybody who it doesn't show. So let's get going. Just wanted to start with a thank you really to everyone for joining us, particularly as I think the last year's caused a bit of webinar fatigue for everybody. So we're keen to keep this session short and focused. But I think the info Ollie's got to share with us this morning should be really helpful in guiding us really where our security focus should be in the coming months. He'll be having a look at the latest threat trends, cyber criminal tactics, and talking with you about how to keep your network as secure as possible in the coming year. We'll also be having a look at WatchGuard's Authpoint solution and have some sort of free trials and stuff around that if anyone's interested in giving that a go. Before we get into it, a little bit of housekeeping. We'll be recording the event for everyone who's unable to make it, and Sarah will actually make sure that everyone gets a copy of the slides as well. Make a note of any questions. Ollie's a questions at the end of the session kind of guy, so save them up, and he or will be happy to try and answer any of them at the end of the session, or take them offline and chat with you about them afterwards. So just quickly introduce people here. Joining me is Ollie Venn from WatchGuard, and Pete Cord from our own team here. Pete really kind of heads up the WatchGuard side of what we do here, and so he's available to have a chat with any of you about any questions that you might have. Hopefully we can hear him if he's able to unmute and just say hello. Possibly not. Let's hope he can later when there's some questions to answer. Yeah, let's pass it over to Ollie, who hopefully can get us going, and then he'll hand back to us and we'll fill some questions. So make a note, feel free to send any in, but we'll probably wait to the end to address those. So.
Perfect. Thank you, John. So yeah, hi everybody. I'm Ollie. I'm one of the sales engineers for WatchGuard here in the UK and Ireland. A little bit about my background. I've been working for WatchGuard now for around 3 years. And prior to that, I was infrastructure and security lead for for the UK's largest privately owned car dealership group. So I had around 37 sites across the UK and Europe, and it's how I came across WatchGuard. I needed security that was going to sort of offer me great protection and pretty much do everything that I needed to do as easily as possible as well. Unfortunately, I didn't have a big team behind me, so I came across WatchGuard sort of 10, 11 years ago now, and loved them and loved the product so much that yeah, I ended up starting working for them around 3 years ago. For those that don't know WatchGuard, we've been around since 1996. We are known as a UTM hardware firewall vendor. That's what we started with back in 96. It's our 25th anniversary this year. But we are a security vendor, and we do have a portfolio of products. So endpoint security, multi-factor authentication, the firewalls, like I said, and also secure Wi-Fi solution as well. Today we're just going to have a look at the every quarter we do an incident security or internet security report rather, where we just have a look at some of the trends and what's happening and what we're seeing across the globe in terms of those threats. And then we're going to have a look at Authpoint, which is our multi-factor authentication product as well. And as John said, any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll try and get to those at the end of the slides. So first off, let's have a talk around where we get our data from. What we actually do is we pull data from the Firebox feed. The Firebox feed is an opt-in information. It's on the firewalls. There's a tick box that says send anonymized data to WatchGuard. And we use that data to understand what's actually happening across the world, what threats are being seen, but also where we need to concentrate our efforts on maybe deploy a new service if we're seeing new types of threats to basically mitigate and prevent our customers from being being affected by those. But obviously with that data, we also have really useful, valuable information that we can share with you as well. So that feed basically includes things like the various engines that are detecting and preventing your networks from getting infected. So we're using the Gateway Antivirus feed, which is the legacy AV service using signature based. We have an intelligent AV engine in our firewalls, which is more machine learning, AI. We have APT Blocker, which is a sandbox service, as well as IPS, which is signature based prevention from the network exploit side of things, and also a DNS firewall built into our firewall. So that's looking at the DNS requests and seeing where they're trying to get to. And we're using that information to then be able to populate things like this. And this is the malware trends. So for Q4, sort of year on year, we're seeing some decreasing in malware, although we're seeing additional zero-day type malware, which we're stopping. And we generally think the reason for the decrease in malware is because of the reduced amount of traffic coming through the firewalls, obviously with more and more people working from home, which we'll talk about shortly. But it's significant to note that we're seeing an increase in the zero-day type malware. So zero-day malware basically means that your traditional AV, if you're using signature-based antivirus, so it relies on a signature to block known badware, is no longer able to detect this. And we're seeing a rise in this zero-day. And you can see here that we're seeing sort of 60-odd% is classified as zero-day on a worldwide view. In the UK, this is actually significantly higher. We see it up to sort of 80, even 90% at times as being zero-day. And that's why it's really important to make sure that you've got new evasive technique or new techniques to detect the evasive types of malware, which we cover with our firewalls as well as our endpoints. Some of the standout malware that we saw in Q3 and Q4, this should actually say, sorry, is Emoted. So this is basically a backdoor. It's been around since 2017, and it's kind of used to leverage further attacks. And it's definitely the number one malware by volume. There's a couple of others in there which I wanted to highlight because they're related to password stealing, and we're seeing this in a rise now. So using malicious Office documents to spread it, and also other types of malware that basically steals passwords and getting those user sensitive information, potentially then to leverage further attacks, sort of lateral movements, once you've got somebody's credentials, even if it's not an IT admin, it could just be somebody further down the chain, maybe an Office 365 user you've now got inside the organization. You can start sending other emails, maybe that contain further payload, things like that. So we're definitely seeing those types of attacks on the rise. The malware detected by the region. So we're seeing in EMEA, so the European sort of region, we see a higher percentage of malware, and I mentioned that a minute ago because in the UK we definitely see a higher number than the global average as well. I'm not sure particularly why that is. Sometimes it can even be seasonal. So we saw in November 2019, in the run up to the election, the numbers increased. The zero-day type malware and the types of malware that we saw, which went through the roof. After the election, it then dropped off. And then we saw COVID happen where people are suddenly being forced to work from home. And we saw them increase again then. There was a lot of like malware tracking services, etc. So it can definitely be seasonal as well. These are some of the top network attacks that we're seeing. So a lot of sort of legacy types of attacks, but still being utilized. So things like web brute force login. With a lot of people working from home, services are being pushed to the internet, relying on users to connect and access those resources remotely. People often didn't think about security and how to make them ultimately perfectly secure. So we're seeing a rise again in things like brute force logins, people trying to get in using just a username and password. And we'll talk about that when we talk around MFA, that basically every service that's publicly available, i.e. you can access it over the internet, should be secured with an MFA solution to prevent sort of lateral movement, people getting leaked credentials and getting in to those accounts. This is from our DNSWatch feed. This is where we're seeing firewall DNS requests. And we're seeing a lot of hits. So malware, we're hosted on a content delivery network, 700,000 hits just to that one site alone, being blocked by the firewall and our DNSWatch service, as well as many phishing attacks and compromised websites as well. So there's a lot of these type of attacks are where you're relying on the users to not click a button. And unfortunately, we're always in the hands of our users with security. And if we're relying on them to not click it, you can see here the evidence shows that they're gonna click it. So we need to rely on technology to make sure that when they do click it, something is going to be blocking them. And here's just some of those defensive tips from that feed information. Phishing email, it just remains common, and they're getting more sophisticated and more targeted now as well. So they will look at your organization, maybe in LinkedIn, and see what's happening to try and get an understanding of who, like somebody higher up, maybe target lower people in the organization with an email pretending to be the CEO or the chief financial officer, whoever it might be, to then get them to respond to it. Web attacks are still very common, so if you have any services that are publicly available and you're responsible for the security for those, make sure that they are being protected, making sure that you're kept up to date, and that administrators' credentials and any credentials really are secure. And then finally, a new rise, and I didn't mention it, but we're seeing targets for things like IoT devices. If you've got legacy equipment in your network, maybe it's an IoT device that got put in a few years ago now, that's likely to have some kind of vulnerabilities to it. So if you're not protecting those by keeping them patched, because there are no patches available for them, it's essential that you know exactly what they're doing, what access they've got, are they publicly available, are they connecting to various services, etc. Because often they're put into a network and forgotten about, and they can almost be a backdoor into your network that you're unaware of. We're going to take a look at the endpoint threats because some of these numbers are quite alarming. We've seen over the last year, so this is actually a look on the whole of 2020, the rise in numbers. Now, at first glance to this graph, you might think, well, it's a little bit of a rise, but it's not that significant. Have a look at the numbers again. The chart on the left actually doesn't go up equally. It goes 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, a million. So actually, if I was to break this down and put it in lateral, an equal chart, it would look something like this. Because we're seeing such huge numbers of threats landing on the endpoint or being targeted by the endpoint, especially because those users are now remote, maybe not being protected by a firewall, the endpoint is having to do more work to prevent and detect and obviously prevent those threats from happening. And again, we're relying on the user. If they're remote and they're not protected by a firewall at home, how do we know that they're not opening up emails or downloading stuff or clicking things in social media that they really shouldn't be doing? And that is quite a significant rise in threats that are hitting the ground. So some points of a protection for you. Making sure your browser is kept up to date and any sort of systems really. If you have some good patch management software, it's really key to utilize that to make sure that your environment is staying up to date. But also really key with that is making sure that the devices are staying up to date regardless of where they are. So the patch management system ideally should be cloud-based, be able to take control of those endpoints regardless of whether they're in the office or at home. At least you know they're still being protected. Keep an eye out for malicious script delivery methods. So often we're seeing like Office documents coming through. They will warn you if it's a macro, but if it's another form of script, it's not going to tell you. And they're often pulling in information or using tools that are there already, lay of the land, sort of using PowerShell scripts, etc., to leverage these types of attacks. And obviously ransomware. We're seeing it's still a steady flow of ransomware. A lot of it is still just overrun of WannaCry taking environments. So making sure that you've got good ransomware protection on those endpoints as well. We're just going to have a look at a couple of the security incidents. So the big one for Q4 was the SolarWinds one, which you may have heard about. And basically, there was a backdoor that was hidden in the Orion platform quite some time ago. And they used command and control traffic and hid that actually quite cleverly through fake telemetry traffic. So hiding that, so it made it harder to understand where it was coming from. They then used specific malware that was targeting the Visual Studio tools, allowing them to basically inject into that platform. We then think another third-party hacker or threat group basically came in and started taking advantage of this as well, where a web shell was then delivered for a zero-day exploit into the platform. And that required the network access to exploit that excuse me, exploit that server. So let's have a look at the timeline of how long that's actually been going on for before it was fully detected, and obviously the investigations are still ongoing with this. Apologies for the dates, they are in American format, but we can see back in September 2019 is when the threat actors first access the SolarWinds, all the way up to early part of this year where they're releasing sort of like new findings and stuff, and trying to understand really what's happened, and that's still ongoing today. So some of the takeaways from this is you need to be deploying EDP, EDPR, not relying on those traditional methods anymore for detection. Like I said, if you're just relying on blocking known badware, you're going to get infected at some point in time. You need to change that mentality to make sure that you're now only allowing known goodware, because it's the way of the world. There's so much zero day coming out that's evasive of the traditional detection methods that you need to be stepping up the game and protecting the endpoints. Audit your permissions. Make sure you know who has got access to what, and that there's no legacy permissions, but also that you're securing that with MFA as well. If there's anything that's internet exposed, maybe you can hide that behind a VPN. Don't open it up to the internet. Enforce people to connect to a VPN first, to then connect to the web service. There's various steps, and obviously NetThreat will be able to help you through any of these if you wanted to understand how to help. And WatchGuard have got a whole portfolio that will be able to cover you and protect you for these environments too. I want to mention the Twitter breach. It was in Q3, but it kind of ties in with everything. So you may have seen this. High-profile celebrities and politicians basically started tweeting out, "Hey, send me $1,000, and I'm going to send you $2,000 back." And they had a Bitcoin link in there. The threat actors in this case actually gained over 100,000 in Bitcoin sent to their to their Bitcoin wallet. So it was a successful attack. And at the time, people were like, how did this happen? They assumed that the people that were spreading this had either signed up to something or they had been compromised. And actually, it was an internal employee at Twitter. Through social engineering, they get access to that user's credentials and basically were able to get into a back-end system that allow them to post this information and post these threats. So it's really key to audit your user's credentials and making sure that only people who should have access are getting access. Phishing training is obviously critical, making sure that your users aren't clicking on phishing links. But like I said, if you can also deploy infrastructure or technology rather to prevent that as well. So if a user does click a phishing link, it's going to block it. But with our DNSWatch service, what we actually do is we redirect them to a training portal, because there's no better time to teach a user than when they've just made a mistake, and we can be like, hey, you've done this, you really shouldn't have done this. Here's how you can detect and prevent in future clicking the same types of phishing links again. Make sure you're looking for anomalies. Understand what's happening in your environment, making sure you know where people are connecting from. If you've got several users all connecting from the same external IP address, that's kind of fishy. So have a look and understand what normal behavior looks like in your environment. If you can say, I've got the logs, I can see what's happening in my environment, I perfectly understand it, you're doing everything right. But if you've got a firewall but you don't look at the logs, it's almost, I wouldn't say exactly the same, but you might as well not have a firewall in place. The visibility and the insight into what's happening is just as powerful as a firewall at times. Obviously the firewall is going to block stuff, but if it's things like this that's coming out of the normal because of a credential leak, etc., then you need advanced techniques and own visibility into that to actually understand. And again, making sure that anybody with higher privilege have got additional security. And in fact, I would even go a step further and say everybody should have additional security, regardless of where they are, because of that lateral movement threat. If somebody's lower down the chain gets their credentials leaked, then they could take advantage of that. So that kind of leads me nicely now into Authpoint, which, like I said, is WatchGuard's MFA solution, multi-factor authentication. It goes above and beyond the two-factor authentication you may know, which relies on sort of text messages, which are inherently unsecure, and email, etc. We now deliver this via the cloud, and it's a really unique solution. And WatchGuard has always been about making things easy. We believe that every organization should have access to the same security as everybody else. There's no threat actor light or WannaCry light or phishing light or anything like that that's going to attack the smaller organizations. No matter how big a player you are, you're going to get the same threats. Whether you're a one-man band up to a 100,000-man band, you're still going to face the same type of threats. So that's why we've delivered Authpoint. We saw 2FA as being expensive, hard to manage, not really covering the market the way it should do. So we've deployed our Authpoint and made it simple. We have great extensive MFA coverage, so we work with dozens of third parties to integrate with them. In fact, it's probably closer to 200 or 300 third party integrations that we've gotten set up now. There's a single sign-on to make that easy for your users as well. We have a Mac and Windows login to protect those devices, as well as servers, etc. It's hosted from WatchGuard Cloud, so there's no infrastructure required. It uses a soft token on a mobile app, so iOS and Android, or we do have a hardware token to give you an OTP if you need it, and it's using multi-factor, so push messages, biometrics of the phone, even the mobile DNA to lock it down to that specific device. The app is really straightforward for the user to use. There's nothing extra for them to carry. They've already got an Android or iPhone in their pocket. They just install the app and they can secure their resources. And they basically would get a push message come through and say, hey, you're trying to sign into this. Is this you? Yeah, that's me. Perfect. An advantage for your users is they can also secure their own resources. So things like Facebook, their Dropbox, their Twitter, whatever it might be, they can secure those tokens as well with the Authpoint app. It doesn't cost anything extra. There's no overhead for you. The users just using the same app can go ahead and secure their Facebook and make it safe. There's three authentication methods. So there is a push base, which is the most easiest. It says, hey, you're trying to sign into this resource. Is this you? A bit of information. Yes, that's me, or no, it's not me. Nice and easy for the user. Obviously, we need to protect resources whilst you're offline too. So if the user is 37,000 feet in the sky on an airplane traveling somewhere and they want to log into their laptop, it's no good saying to somebody, oh, you can't log in, you have to wait till you're online. They won't be happy. So with our authentication method, it works with a QR, which is a challenge and response. Basically, we show them a QR code, they open the app, scan the QR, it would generate a 6-digit PIN, and they type that in. And we have OTP as well, so we can just display a 6-digit PIN in the app and allow that. You can pick and choose which resources you want users to use. You can have all three. You can have just push-based and QR as they are the two securest methods, or you can have just OTP. It's entirely up to you how you have this. The push technology looks a bit like this. So the user goes to log into the resource. The authentication is then forwarded to WatchGuard Cloud, providing the username and password are okay. The message is sent to the user saying, hey, you're trying to sign in. If they approve it, confirm. The user's now got access to the resources that they need access to. Really, really simple, and reduces that user friction by making it as simple as possible. So WatchGuard use one-time passcodes in the back end, and we actually use ours using time-based events time-based passcodes instead of event-based passcodes. So how they're generated is they're using a unique key and a clock that's pushed together to make this encrypted hash algorithm, and basically both ends make the same calculation to generate that push, that QR, or the OTP. It's an unpredictable password. It's not just a random password. So both ends do need to make that calculation. And that's okay. And that's what most vendors are doing. But there is an additional hidden security issue here. And that's if somebody was to get hold of my device and clone it. So what we've actually done is we've added this mobile DNA layer, which locks the token to that specific device. So we know when the authentication request is happening that that device is the one it should be. And the reason why that's important is if you've got a, say, iPhone user, backs up to the iCloud, and they're using the same username and password across all of their resources and not securing those with 2FA or MFA, their password gets leaked. The threat actor is now logged into their iCloud using their username and password, and what he could do is take a backup of the device, and he's got this. He's got the token, he's got the clock, he can now log into any of the resources that are protected by the MFA. So what we do is we add the mobile DNA, which basically locks it to that device. So in the environment with the hacker, what will actually happen is it's going to be different. We're going to see that that's an emulated device, or it's even another physical iPhone, but it's not the original iPhone that it was installed on, and we will not validate the request. We'd say, hey, you're wrong. You shouldn't be logging into this, and we would prevent that. We are the only vendor in this space that actually has this technology. So one thing with security that I always say, there's nothing worse than having a false sense of security. So if you were relying on this method and your username and password gets stolen, potentially they could still circumvent your MFA. With this method, it's not going to happen because they're going to hit a red flag and it's going to prevent them from logging in. So let's just have a quick look through some of the use cases for MFA. Windows logins, perfect example, whether that's IDP, physical devices, etc. It's still the same experience for the user. They log in using their normal credentials as they would do normally. Then they get a push message sent to them if they're online. It will automatically fire a code to them. They hit approve. That's me trying to log in. Done, straight to their desktop. If they're offline, they just click scan QR or type in the OTP. VPN experience is exactly the same. Username and password as they would do normally, and then they hit connect, and it would just send them a push message. Yes, this is me trying to sign in. Hit approve. You're now connected. If you have multiple software as a service apps, so things like Office 365, Salesforce, Dropbox, GoToMeeting, your users can actually securely sign in once and access all of those resources. So they go to one single URL, they sign in using their username, password, they log in, and then they get presented the applications that they've been secured against. And all they need to do now is click on one of these resources and it will seamlessly sign them into that. So if they clicked Office 365, it would take them to Office 365 and sign them in as them. They don't need to re-enter in their credentials. So making that user experience much more enhanced. If you're trying to log into 10 resources a day and you have to MFA to every single one of those, the users are going to complain. So now with this, you just do it once and it makes life so much easier. As it's from WatchGuard Cloud, it means you can manage it from anywhere, from any device. You can see what's happening. We synchronize with Active Directory, so there's no need to provision new users. You just tell it which AD groups to sync and we pull it through. The users can have more than one authenticator, and there's no additional cost for this. So, like I said, it's locked to a specific phone. But if they want another phone, or they've got an iPad, etc., you can just generate a new token, click 2 clicks of a button, and it will resend them an activation email to open up on their new device. You can see reports as to what's happening, usage, authentications over time, if there's denied notifications. So if there's a big hit at 3 o'clock in the morning, you'd come in here, see who it is. If it's all one user, you'd ring that user up and be like, hey, what were you doing at 3 o'clock? And the chances are it's going to be one of two things. Either they were drunk trying to log into Office 365 and you potentially just saved their career, or it's somebody's got hold of their username and password, and then you tell them, right, change password, enforce password change on them, and then your environment is now secure again. And that's kind of what we think about MFA. It needs to be hassle-free. Traditional organizations generally think of 2FA and MFA as being like really hassle. It's going to cause problems for the IT team or for the user, but we try to keep it as simple as possible. So there's no expensive equipment to maintain. There's no gaps in the coverage. We've tried to cover everything off. There's no like hardware keys and tokens, etc. required. Which just eliminates some of the headache as well. So we've tried to keep it as clean and as simple to use. We've also got another tool, which is called the Dark Web Scanner, which we give you access to. And basically, this means that you can run a report for your environment to see if there's been any account breaches. So you'd put in your domain, run a report, and it would tell you, hey, these accounts have been exposed. It will give you the email addresses, when they were found, etc., and even a bit of the information about like the first four characters of the password. So you can go to your users and be like, hey, are you still using this password anymore? If you are, we need to change it. So it's just giving you that insight, and this is all collected by our threat research team, where they're trawling the dark web all day long to look for new threats and exploits, etc. They come across these data breaches all the time. So all of this information is publicly available, and they've just collated that and put it in a secure platform for our customers to be able to run reports and have a true understanding of what's going on. Skip through some of these animations. There we go. So some of the conclusions: weak and stolen passwords are used in a lot of hacks nowadays. Like I said, once you've got somebody's keys to the kingdom, you can then start leveraging further attacks as well. You don't control the passwords outside of your organization, so be very wary that your users might be using the same password inside the organization as they are outside. So what it takes is for somebody to leak that credential, and you could then become exposed. Um, Enhancing that user experience with things like MFA, for the single sign-on, is going to make the 2FA MFA journey a lot better. And any kind of remote systems that rely on username and credentials should be secured with MFA. Authpoint is a cloud-based application. It's really simple for the users. Send them a push-based message, can securely still log in whilst they're offline, and has that unique device DNA to obviously prevent against token cloning. So how do you get started? Well, we do have a free trial available, which is up to 60 days for 250 users. Once you sign up to that, you can also then check out the dark web scanner, speak to NetThreat. And I'm not just putting this in because I'm talking a NetThreat webinar. I genuinely believe more people, more organizations need to speak to their security partners. It's really hard, and it's one of the biggest shortfalls across the whole of the world is security expertise. Don't think you have to do everything in-house. Speak to a partner, speak to NetThreat, and get them involved as well, because there's often things that you may overlook, and not fully understand. And these guys live and breathe this all day long. They have the experts in-house to be able to offer the protection, and help your organization needs. And finally, get connected with WatchGuard. So we have a security blog, which our threat research team post. It's called Secplicity, and that's available at secplicity.org. And it's all about cybersecurity news, and they do a podcast and stuff. And it really empowers you to understand fully what's happening in the world, so you can obviously offer the best protection. Now it's time for any questions and hopefully some answers. Back to you, John.